Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whoever and wherever you are. This is Ben McLeish of the Zeitgeist movement. And welcome to this week's TZM Global Radio Podcast. We are here for about 2 hours today, primarily speaking with a gentleman called Cameron Watt. Cameron is a self-described left libertarian socialist who has recently engaged in a rather decent way the Zeitgeist movement's main tenets after being asked by his viewership what he might think of them. Cameron and I spend about an hour and three quarters going through the various points of contention. You can find Cameron's original critique by searching the Zeitgeist movement as a libertarian socialist critique on YouTube to get some of the sense there. He spends about 16 minutes talking about some of the ways that the ideas strike him. And we pack some of those out a little bit further later on. The opening brief speech you heard there is by a gentleman who is referenced, in fact, by Cameron. He will be known to some of the audience if you are of the sort of anarchist bent anyway, which our movement is. Our movement certainly overlaps in membership between these organisations. There's nothing too mutually exclusive about them, certainly. That gentleman is Murray Bookchin, speaking about the structural nature of our anti-ecology. In fact, it might remind some speakers of John McMurtry of the University of Guelph, who is in fact speaking at this year's Zeitgeist Day in March 15th in Toronto. And the idea behind the brief excerpt there, and the idea that's expressed also in McMurtry's work, and is indeed the basis for the attitudes that our movement has towards what the present socio-economic issues may in fact be, beyond simply voting for the wrong people, is the idea that there is an organizational inability to deal with the requirements that the ecology has of us. That our place in the world needs to be primarily based on and dictated by the way that the natural world works, our natural resources, their replenishment rates, and the most efficient and sensible way to use these in the most equitable way so as to produce the most harmonious and enriching of lives that we can possibly achieve under those circumstances, always employing technology and human reason and not the vagaries of politics or of particular money orientations in this world. There is a basis that McMurtry speaks of called eco-genocide, and it's very, very similar to how Bookchin describes it there as well. We'll be getting on to Cameron in just a moment, but I wanted to list a couple of the events that are coming up for Zeitgeist Day, which is our annual event day of speeches, so it's very good for people who are completely unfamiliar with the works of the Zeitgeist movement and want to come and see it. I'll list a few of them, although you will find more generally, all of them listed on zdayglobal.org. So around the world, wherever you are, from Australia all the way through to the eastern or western seaboards of America or India, wherever you are, there should be something near you. There are many hundreds of sympathetic events. We have one that we tend to call the main one, which tends to be the one that we sometimes gather our more tenured speakers to speak at. That one's in Toronto this year. I'll give you the address right now as well. The main one is the University of Toronto. The address is 1 King's College Circle, Toronto, Ontario. So if you're there on March 15th, it starts at 10 a.m. and runs till 6 p.m. And we'll feature Peter Joseph, who's the gentleman who created the Zeitgeist film series and is one of our original founders and speakers. Matt Berkowitz, and in fact John McMurtry, whose authorship I have already discussed. There is one in London as well on exactly the same day. Of course, the time zones are different. That is in Red Lion Square and is also discoverable on eventbrite.co.uk or through the UK Facebook group, and will feature from about 6:45 p.m. until just about 10:45 in the evening. 6 or 7 speakers, including Rao Reynolds, the singer from Enter Shikari, the multi-million selling band who have always been very supportive of what we do, and we supportive of them, of course. Miles Dyer, the YouTube personality and General Russia Today interviewee. Myself, I'll be there to introduce the event, and many others as well. Do come along to that. We managed to get tickets down to £5 this year, which is rather good. We're rather pleased with that, and we're very pleased, of course, to have the Ethical Society as the place where we will be discussing it. I'll also list, just for a change, something in the non-English speaking world. There are 3 events in Germany for the Zeitgeist Movement Germany. On the 14th of March, there's an event in Cologne. On the 15th, there's the Z-Day event in Berlin, and the 16th is the Z-Day event in Frankfurt. So you can actually go to, you can go to all 3 if you're in Germany. The one on the 14th, these are all discoverable on eventbrite.de. If you just search Z-Day 2014, you'll find them there. They're listed, and the tickets obviously are separately available as well. So they're running as well. And then there are a couple in San Diego and Los Angeles as well, if you're in America but can't make it to Toronto, up in Canada, which you can go to as well. Z-Day Los Angeles is in fact on the 29th of March. It's a little bit later, like a couple of weeks later, and that runs from 12 p.m. to 5 p.m. as well. And those are actually based on a donation basis as well. Or you can in fact get them free as well. So you have the option either to donate or to do them free. And if you're in San Diego, just slightly to the north, then they are producing one as well. That is on the 15th of March, again, just like all the other events are, apart from Los Angeles, running from 6:30 p.m. till 9:30 p.m. as well, at the Joyce Beers Community Center in Vermont Street, San Diego. Like I said, that's only 6 events I've listed there. There are many, many on zdayglobal.org. So if you feel like you want to come along, then please do. It would be great to have you there. For the London one, I must admit, about half the tickets are already sold. So if you do want to come along, make sure you get those in advance. And so to this week's discussion, which I had, it was very nice of Cameron, who produced Libertarian Socialist Rants on YouTube, to come on and discuss with me some of the objections and critiques that he had raised against the movement. We are very pleased to have him. I should say it like that. We're very used to extremely adversarial critiques by usually the indoctrinated folk who are either defending the current system or advocating something that's even more brutal. So we are very used to denigrating attacks. Cameron, on the other side of things, conducts himself very nicely in his critiques and deserves our measured respects and responses. And that's really what this show is for. We also list quite a few of the sources that Cameron himself finds useful to inform his worldview in the sort of left libertarian area. We list those in the show notes as well for this show. So feel free to dig into this information and evaluate it, and to confront it, and to assimilate what one can. Particularly interesting, and in fact available entirely for free if one has a Kindle device or wants to use the Kindle Cloud Reader, which everybody would have, is Mutual Aid by Peter Kropotkin, which was produced in 1902. It's a very interesting sort of addendum to Darwinian models. I think he slightly mischaracterizes what Darwin actually meant when he was talking about sort of what has been come to known as the survival of the fittest, but it's for free, it's available, it's fairly short, and it's written in plain, well, it's available in plain English. So there are many of those things, but we list all of those. And now on to my interview with Cameron. Annoyingly, I forgot to record the first 20 seconds of the interview, so really what happens after I welcome Cameron to the show is I simply ask him where he got some of his inspiration from to become politically active, and here he is responding to that question.
Really a combination of factors that sort of got me into it, really kind of just a general dissatisfaction with current sort of state of affairs, both politically and economically. The fact that the sort of prevailing institutions of our society are completely failing to meet human needs. And so really there's, I kind of adopted a kind of anarchist approach in terms of thinking that's really about just identifying, challenging, and dismantling authority of a kind of hierarchical kind that's really to do with like sort of dismantling pyramid structures and setting up horizontal kind of arrangements, you know. So that's kind of what I'm keen on, really. Yeah.
You seem to have built a very decent following, or at least a very good view count, with your YouTube channel, Libertarian Socialist Rants, I think it's called, right?
Yeah.
How soon did you find that it caught on when you started posting things?
Well, that was quite a while ago. Like, it was more back in 2011, I think it was, that I started making videos. that was more as part of a general ranting community who basically just make videos about things that they're pissed off at. So I mean, I didn't start off making videos as an anarchist, so it was really a more sort of recent thing that I've kind of focused specifically on political content, as well as talking about ecology and other stuff as well.
Yeah, sure. You seem to have an interesting focus. It doesn't just tend to be like, from what I've seen as well, because I went through quite a lot of it today. It's not just anarchism in theory and maybe in history as well. You seem to focus a lot on the burning topics of the day. UKIP comes off very badly in your opinion, which is wonderful. For anybody who doesn't know who's listening, because we do have an American audience and an audience around the world as well, luckily they wouldn't know who UKIP is. UKIP stands for the UK Independence Party, or essentially, I sort of agree with your broad assessment, essentially a moneyed, racist, conservative outgrowth party. There's always one. Every country has one, and it usually is when economics becomes bad that they tend to come out of the woodwork and practice their demagoguery to wedge themselves into some kind of power. But I did enjoy your rants on those and the rants in general. You are also, if you don't mind me saying, a very keen and very accomplished musician. Tell me about your focus there, just briefly, if you want.
Well, I'm basically mainly a pianist, although I like sort of composition, and I also play a bit of the drum kit as well. I suppose it doesn't really affect much of my political leanings, although I would say that certainly creative freedom to me is an important issue, and that's the only area that I would say that they kind of overlap. And sometimes if I'm doing like songwriting of some kind, then I might inject a few political themes into it,
Sure. That's good stuff. Well, our viewers can go to Libertarian Socialist Rants and see some of your... because you put them on the same channel, didn't you? So that was very good. And by the way, your pronunciation of Rosenkavalier is absolutely spot on, so well done about that.
Nice
as
one.
well. My father is a classical musician as well, and does that too, so it's a nice affinity. I actually think that there seems to be a preponderance, at least in our movement, of musicians as well. Peter Joseph is a musician, you may not know that.
Yeah.
He wrote the music, and he's also a drummer as well, so it's something about percussion, man. Matt Berkowitz, one of our Canadian more accomplished speakers, is also a drummer, self-taught as well, which really pisses me off because I can't play the drums at all. And in fact, we have another guy called Jim Phillips in the UK who's also a drummer, so this just seems to be, maybe it's just that a lot of people are musical and we haven't realised, or maybe it's that there's something about expression that bleeds over into these kinds of spheres. So for anybody who's listening who's not sure who Cameron is and why I've got him on, Cameron produced what, in my opinion, is actually the first fully formed and sensible and honest and non-rude response to the Zeitgeist movement. You might find that astonishing, Cameron, that I say that after the roughly 5 years that we've been in existence. But as you can imagine, and as you've probably seen yourself from your own anarchist leanings and what that produces, the dominant values of our society mean that even ordinary people who are not so-called guardians of the status quo very much become that when you question the basic assumptions of any society. It's the autoimmune response system of any society whatsoever. It doesn't matter what the leaning is. It's particularly loud in capitalism, but that's probably just because capitalism is itself rather loud. So we've had everything from very rude, misinformed individuals to Austrian economists. I don't know why I made that distinction. all the way through to flat out pseudo scholars. Actually, we've had that, and we've had even we think we can pretty much prove paid trolls as well, because that's probably not a surprise to you either. There are historical references to this, and I think these days pretty much anybody can afford one. So it was very nice when our membership started to share your 16-minute video, which went through what we promote. I say we, what the movement collection of ideas is, as well as, I would say, probably three broad criticisms. And it was very nice. And I hope, I think I asked you in our previous conversation as well, I would hope that the reaction of the community had been in line with the honesty you had shown. I did notice on your Facebook wall today a couple of people getting furious for no reason. I would apologize for them if they even would allow me to speak for them. We tend to be fairly leaderless, and I should point out that I don't really represent anything at all in the movement in terms of leadership or structure or anything like that. I just I'm one of the loudmouths that's been there since close to the beginning, but equally I could be gone tomorrow and it would be exactly the same. But never mind. People react to criticism in different ways, as we know, because we are in the business of criticizing society. But I thought I would get you on because it would be nice to have somebody who has done their reading explain to the movement the various ideas of libertarianism, the various ideas of anarchism, and for me to maybe add some additional points to the very short criticisms, or if you like, reply that we issued a week or two ago on the same podcast. So with your permission, that'll be sort of what we aim for. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Cool. So give us the elevator speech of what an anarchist is.
Okay. Well, basically, some people say that anarchism is a specific society, whereas I would say it's better to describe anarchism as a process in which essentially the core sort of principle is that hierarchical authority is not self-justifying. Now, when we talk about hierarchical authority, that's meant to mean kind of command and obedience, that kind of thing, or situations in which there is an inequality in the degree of control that people have over their own lives. So it doesn't have to necessarily manifest itself in direct command and obedience. It can be like more cultural, like with patriarchy, for example. Now, the core is really that that's not self-justifying, and that unless a justification can be provided for that kind of authority by those who exercise it, then fundamentally it should be dismantled, particularly by those who are having authority exercised over them, and essentially reorganized from below. So you basically, that's kind of your way of, it's a method of thinking about the world, really, and a process of kind of skepticism towards authority in general. Now, when you talk about libertarianism, it's very distinct from your kind of ANCAP group, which Peter Joseph has made quite a few good criticisms of the ANCAP crowd. They're almost unanimously hated by the vast majority of anarchists. So yeah, it's basically anti-hierarchy, really. That's okay. The sort of core of anarchism.
Yeah, it's quite telling that the first types of anarchists we came the first types of anarchists we came across when we were busy producing our discourse online, or what I like to call thinking out loud. That's really what we're learning out loud, is really what we do. Were in fact the ANCAPs, were the people who wanted to have no structure and all the capitalism in the world, and whoever has the biggest private army wins, and they are the noisiest. It's one of the strangest things. I don't know why that is. Maybe it's just because they have the most money already. I mean, the Mises Institute is one of the big proponents of that, and they have the resources to produce daily newsletters, which is quite, I know what that's like. It's quite tricky.
It gives the sort of philosophy that right-wing libertarianism actually promotes is a kind of, it gives the illusion of opposition to the status quo by basically taking typical kind of decent sort of positions that people will take, like the fact that the war on drugs is a complete sham, the complete disastrous foreign policy of the United States, all of these different kind of somewhat anti-authoritarian positions, and then they come to the conclusion that, we'll have stateless capitalism, which
absolutely,
because of course that kind of, unfortunately, that kind of thing, well, I say unfortunately, but not really, that kind of thing can never really exist fundamentally, because really they kind of support each other. The market and the state, they're fundamentally interlinked because of the general tendency for power consolidation. I suppose that it really provides the illusion of opposition, really, and it's a way of just upholding the status quo that really gives the illusion that people are not conforming to what's kind of going on. You get I don't think that anyone who funds these ANCAP radio stations and so on, Free Domain Radio and all this other stuff, I don't think that anyone who sort of funds that, they have corporate backers, but I think that corporate backers know full well that they basically need this, as Noam Chomsky calls it, this conservative nanny state to protect their privilege, really.
Yeah, I can get behind that, and it's an argument we always make, is that the market and the state are the product of the same value problems. So hit us with your libertarian strain, which type you are.
Well, yeah, there's been a general sort of tradition, and again, it's just the same sort of outgrowth of the sort of principles that I was mentioning earlier of fundamentally just being a kind of rejection of kind of hierarchical authoritarianism. However, it's like, when I say I'm kind of a libertarian socialist, a lot of people get confused and they always mix it up with this kind of right-wing libertarian thing, which is very recent. The traditional libertarian approach has actually been a more sort of socialist/communist thing. Really, the view is it's more libertarian socialism as well as like most varieties of anarchism. You have like autonomous Marxism as well, which is kind of like they subscribe to a Marxian analysis of capitalism, but they also reject the state, and they have these other ways of thinking, and there's kind of syndicalist ideas, just a very fairly broad pattern of different sort of left libertarian movements that really, I would say, the core politically and economically, other than rejection of hierarchy, is really to do with rejection of capitalism and the state. The phrase, for example, "no gods, no masters," was a French feminist, anarchist and labor union slogan. And I find it quite funny because sometimes you see on the ANCAP and right-wing libertarian Facebook pages, they actually use the phrase "no gods, no masters," and they put these little pictures up without realizing that it's actually rooted in labor union activism and kind of socialist thought. It's kind of funny because my kind of view is that right-wing libertarianism is really very contradictory because fundamentally it supports systems of hierarchy and domination. They're fine to have masters so long as they're industrialists, and the kind of ahistorical approach where they kind of ignore the fact that the kind of industrial system that we have has always been interlinked with quite a powerful state is it's to me it's just fantasy, really.
Yeah. Yes, controlled opposition does spring to mind. Okay, well, I think that gives people a good idea of the sort of where you're coming from. I'd imagine also that quite a few people, as I've done by checking with some of our members who are more of the anarchist school, would admit there's a huge amount of overlap. There's no point in denying that, and I don't think really we ever have. But I'll get into, I think, probably some of the reasons why our ultimate discourse doesn't end up calling itself one of those things, despite probably flat out supporting as parallel movements some of these people, just like we would support, for example, cyberneticians or anything like that. Okay, so let's do what I should be trained to do by now after 5 years of talking about this and give you, or at least the listener, I think, an overview of what we talk about at the Zeitgeist movement, because I think you've pretty adequately understood most of what we do. So the Zeitgeist movement sees the broadest picture possible for global society. We don't recognize countries because countries are artificial divisions created by age-old power structures and age-old wars of aggression and hierarchy. There's a really great chapter that I can cite that explains this far better than I ever would by a gentleman called R. Buckminster Fuller. He wrote a book called Critical Path, and in there is a chapter called Legally Piggly, which explains this. Further than not recognizing any countries because of the ideological or even scientific non-basis of them, is that we understand we take into account the entire earthly system of resources and interlocking things, very much as the cyberneticians did in the 1960s and 70s, although inadequately at that time, as a closed system. It is, in fact, the situation that we find ourselves in, and given the fact that we now have the kind of technologies and the kind of worldview, having gone into space and looked back and seen our home the way it really is, we advocate a system whereby we do the same as what essentially the anarchists want to do, which is dismantle the present way of life and adapt it to fit in with the state of the planet as it is. We can't be building any kind of society on something kind of infinite growth, other than the wonderful sun income that we have every day. We are essentially spaceship Earth, if you put it that way.
Yeah.
And that requires of us a certain type of attitude towards resources. If we want to be sustainable, if we want to survive, if we want our children and grandchildren to be cancer-free and free of debt and poverty and all the things that pretty much any kind of person would guarantee is a bad thing, and to be enriched, to live long and healthy and fruitful and fulfilled lives. Isn't it funny that when I say that, alarm bells are probably going off in the listener's head saying, there goes that utopian nonsense once again. How ridiculous to assume that life should be anything but the struggle and alienating nonsense that it has to be, because that's the kind of system I'm emotionally attached to, something we call culture. So that's the very, very broad view. Now, there are a couple of different ways of doing this, but the most effective would be to essentially declare the resources of the planet as common heritage, as Jacques Fresco, the socio-cyberneer who partly encouraged the movement through his Venus project, would put it. And there is also a growing social side, I think, to this movement that gets eclipsed, and I think got eclipsed when you were confronted with what our main output is. And that is that it has become very, very obvious through the developing social sciences that what the anarchists propose, in other words, this essentially horizontal, egalitarian, no masters, no gods, no gods, no kings, only man, is actually good for you. It's not something that promotes psychosocial well-being to be dominated over with a class structure that at once reminds you of how little you have and demands of you that you feel jealous of or guilty of or aspirational towards the unattainable wealth in the upper echelons, which can never be yours because of the very self-preserving nature of state and market and all the rest of it. So we end up with that kind of thing. That is physically bad for people. It makes them live shorter lives. It promotes violence. It promotes prison population growth and length of prison sentences and everything else. So that's the bit that probably is buried a little bit in our materials. But we maintain that if we were to follow a high-tech, probably minimalist, but high-tech structure of global organization, you would be able to take far greater care of the needs of people and therefore extend out the wants of people as well, because once you've taken care of the basics and you're wasting less resources doing it, there's so much more flexibility for people to do the fascinating things that they do all by themselves anyway. So we don't tend to comment too much on what people should or could do in their free time. We try and make the society as strong and as minimal as possible so that people can then get on with the business of culture the way it is without accidentally prioritizing culture over, for example, the starving billion people that we have on this planet at the moment. That is roughly the elevator pitch I could do. There is a lot of other stuff in there, but that's good enough, I think.
Yeah.
So how does that strike you? Is that all right?
Yeah, that seems basically pretty sound, to be honest. I mean, to me, the sort of basic premises are very uncontroversial. We can't have a state of affairs in which we basically treat the planet like an inexhaustible mine. That's certainly the way that capitalism has developed, and it's an observable failure to meet human needs. And of course, the alarm bells are of course going off. And whenever we see our ideas observably failing in practice, I mean, this is more popular in America, but there's a little slogan that goes, "That's not capitalism, that's corporatism." And of course, that's basically a kind of side, a kind of a side thing, where you basically, it's a way of basically just ignoring, again, the sort of historical factors and the relationship between the state and the market and private property relations. Again, it's just, it's ridiculous, really. And we are living in a corporatist society, if you want to call it that, but to kind of treat that as though that's an abstraction or a deviation from what capitalism is really about is nonsense. It's nonsensical. Some people say, another word is crony capitalism. why is there a need for usage of the word crony? I would just say capitalism, because it's just, it's always what happens. Every single time it's been attempted to be implemented, this elite has been created of wealthy, moneyed classes, which gets in bed with the state, and that's essentially how it goes. The state also, in itself, has its own kind of, it represents its own interests economically, even if it's a so-called socialist state, like you would have in the USSR or something, where usually, well, I would certainly view the state as being an inherently capitalistic institution, because it perpetuates economic and social hierarchy. It's completely outdated in terms of its general premises. And sorry, it's a bit of a rant there.
No, that's good. No, it needs to be said, because we have to say exactly the same thing as well. We put it in a slightly different way. We say that there is essentially a value system disorder at the basis of life. There is, and this will form part of the third point that I wanted to make, but you don't need to insert the word crony, you don't need to pretend it's financism. We have said before that it's monetaryism, because essentially the replacement of life needs or real indicators of actual well-being of a society, so for example the level of clean air, the level of clean water, the non-existence of disease, has all been replaced by money tickers. And as long as that graph is going up, everything else can be ignored as an externality. So we've essentially made that argument in the past. Now, you make the following criticism in your video, and then I'm going to insert the video. This is the bit where you say that it depends. Do we want to talk about how we don't talk about human needs outside of economics? We've sort of done that already, haven't we? We could do it explicitly, actually, because I do have one point for you, actually. Yeah, because you talk about the racism thing as well. Let's do it.
I listened to the podcast last week that's really saying, well, the kind of end that's being promoted is basically meeting human needs. And, well, of course, it's not always something like... the efficiency isn't always the fundamental priority. And that's just something that I didn't quite pick up on. I wasn't aware of that when I first sort of heard about it.
Yes, that's the thing. We talk about efficiency. There was a really interesting UFO story. I don't really subscribe to this kind of stuff, but it was nice because even if it was totally false, it still had a wonderful story in it. This guy had this really, really epic vision that he met these people, I can't remember what it was, some kind of bizarre aliens, and their religion was efficiency. And it's like, as long as you follow that, everything else kind of takes care of itself, which is probably a really good idea for a religion. If you just fetishize one thing, it would be the correct use of material resources. But yes, this is probably our fault for not describing quite correctly. Like, for example, you mentioned in Defining War, Peter Joseph says...
Defining Peace. Yeah.
Defining Peace, of course, sorry. It shows you how well I know my stuff. That it's actually inefficient to be a warlike state, and you make the very interesting point that what if we had a slightly racist society, or a racist society that made it slightly more efficient? Is that how am I correctly saying that?
I mean, I'm not saying that could possibly ever be the case, but it's a thought experiment,
No, it's a good one. It's a good one. The only point I wanted to make with that is that the way that we see racism, and I think it's probably true of you as well, is racism is actually a product of inefficient education, of a non-complete realization of the fact that there is in fact no such thing as race. I think science has essentially proven there is the human race, and in fact we are related to all other animals and living beings on the planet as well. That's part of the amazing thing about being alive, is it happened just once and then diversified. And so it would almost be a marker of inefficiency that racism would still dominate as an ideological value set. That's all. So we see it the other way around. But I do understand your point, and it's actually a very entertaining way of testing the theory and saying, well, what if, ripping the beating heart out of a small child every day would really make the sun come up? Even if that wasn't true, if it made everyone slightly happier, would it be any good? Yes, but that argument, of course, is not the one you made, and is one that is, funnily enough, made by religious fundamentalists sometimes as well. But you do bring up a decent critique of how we characterize planning, because it's such a loaded word. It's if I say central planning, everyone runs away with the Red Scare in panic again. And I know you and I have already had a conversation about this, but I'll say it again. The kind of centralization that we talk about in our system is actually quite tricky to communicate, except with two examples that I can think of. We talk about commonality within the system. We talk about, and we probably don't talk about it loudly enough, so I'll do that here. We do not envision, as you may imagine by now, the idea of a round table of white-shirted scientists cackling as they decide what they think is efficient and who gets to eat and all the rest of it. This is, of course, something that Gosplan did outright in the USSR, and if anything has been proven, it's that alone, ignoring all the moral ideas and the fact that is already, again, a stratified society and would have concomitant health issues, is just simply not efficient, is not going to work. The human mind is no longer capable, or I think probably ever was capable, of a central planning in that kind of sense. What we do talk about is standardization. And I'll give you two examples that can make this much more clear. If you want a really good book on it, The Wealth of Networks by Yochai Benkler, who's just a computer systems chap, talks about the internet a bit. But we'll say the internet first. This is a system of nodes, of relays, of standardized language and standardized protocols that allows for the system to be strong in the face of all kinds of stressors, and allows it to be functional and abundant without too much oversight. Now, I'll admit one thing, which is that there is, in fact, the W3 consortium, but all that they do, and they are essentially a fairly open group anyway, all they do is agree the standards. The standards don't affect how you use the system, really. It means that .info, or isn't there a .XXX now as well for porn sites? There's just a standardization of language, of protocols, not of content or of use. This is what they call an end-to-end system. That's one of the backbones of probably how a resource-based economy, a natural resource-based economy, would function in its high-tech sense. It is, of course, possible to have a very low-tech resource-based economy where you're just literally living hand-to-mouth. Reminded me of the graphics I saw of the anarcho-syndicalists in the Spanish Revolution, before the Spanish Revolution, beating their... because they didn't have the kind of tools that we have today. The second example I can give is the traffic system, which, of course, that's very similar to the internet anyway. We even call it the information superhighway. Everybody is quite happy, even the Austrian economists, with their talk of violence and imposing your rules on me and all that. They're quite happy to stop at a red light. They know what happens if they don't. Someone cartwheels into them at 70 miles an hour. They're quite happy to drive on only one side of the road. That's 50% of your rights gone right there, according to at least some Austrians. This is because the uncoordinated use of a public highway with physical goods would, of course, be catastrophic. Yeah. So that is centralized in the sense that it's centrally conceived. It's not centrally owned, and I think that's probably where I hope I've made it a bit clear to you. Does that sort of help with the sort of the primary basis? I know there's other stuff there about resource distribution. But...
Yeah. No, I understand that sort of idea. Again, I should stress with the sort of anarchist position, the position is not that all authority or that all even that all rules are wrong. For example, like if there's a good example that Noam Chomsky gives. So I'm a big fan.
That's fine. So a lot of our members are. So am I.
He mentions, if a kid runs into the road, it would be okay to grab them and pull them back, because doing so might, save their life. And so there are certain instances in which limiting human autonomy is justified. It's not always justified, but I would say that it's not always justified, but it should always be questioned. And I would still maintain that if people advocating it can't provide a justification for it, then get rid of it.
Absolutely, that's a key point. That's actually something that we mention a lot as well. By definition, every aspect, whether physical or structural, of the kind of system we talk about is up for replacement. Should be replaced immediately if it can be demonstrated that something better or something more equitable or something more efficient can exist.
Oh, well, that's,
of course,
that's utopianism. That's utopian.
But yeah, I mean, because it's end-to-end, because it's open source, because there should be access, just like Wi-Fi is becoming more and more accessible, just like roads are becoming wider and wider to accommodate the larger traffic flow, although admittedly that's done so poorly nowadays, and we've got so many better examples of what we could do, which is yet another argument against the current system. That is something I think where the anarchists would be in total alignment, I would hope, with us as well, is that all of it is up for grabs. There are no sacred cows. There is no this way or the highway. Everything, because if we just look at all of history, the only thing that has ever been done is that things have been improved or have been disproved and then taken away and have been surpassed and have been improved upon, and that should actually be made the central feature of anything that we propose. That also, by the way, means that one day everything I've ever produced on this subject is going to be hopelessly out of date, and I will be swallowed up into history just as I deserve to be. So this is very important. Whereas I think if you looked at most of the political or historical movements, they tend to have their sacred cows. Murray Rothbard springs to mind for some reason. Now, there was a point you had about direct democracy. This is, I think, very good. I will play that piece here just so we can catch up with what we talk about next.
In an interview with Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks, Peter Joseph suggests otherwise.
Real economy would take resources that we have and assess them for their scientific relevance, assess them for what they're actually supposed to do, what their highest efficacy is.
But who does the assessment?
The assessment is done by reason, and this is something that people hate it when I say it, because they think that somebody in some round table in some Soviet circle is going to make all the decisions for all the world.
This implies that there isn't going to be a centralized authority. After he talks about how great logic and reason is for a little bit, Peter Joseph then goes on to mention direct democracy.
We have to create a system of interaction of humanity where everyone decides. Now, what I mean by that is we have this thing called a direct democracy. It's very common now. It's used in technical circles. We apply the concept of direct democracy, except it isn't people seeing a referendum. It isn't people voting on something. It's actually about the true established element of society that keeps us going, which is industry itself, not politics.
What this implies is direct democratic control over industry, which anarcho-syndicalists and anarcho-communists have been working towards for quite a while. And of course this negates the idea of central planning. However, Peter doesn't make this clear, and instead he talks about how important it is that we need to use reason, to such an extent that it blurs the lines as to what he's actually advocating.
Give me what you mean by direct democracy.
Well, I would say that essentially the people who are affected by a particular decision possess the moral right to have a say in that decision and how it's made. So there's a guy called Michael Albert who basically advocates what's called participatory economics, which is it's another subset of libertarian socialism. I don't completely agree with Paracon, as it's called for short, myself, but he gives in some of his lectures, or he sort of talks about how basically there are certain norms that we can establish when we're making decisions. So like, if you're in the workplace and, well, if you decide at your desk, you know, if you're going to have a photo, or if you decide if you're going to have a photo at your desk, how do you make that decision? Well, you make it. What you say goes in that instance. Like Stalin, you know, it's a dictator, it's a dictatorial method of making decisions. But of course, that makes sense in that particular instance because you're the only person who's going to be affected by it. Now, on the other hand, if you want to bring your stereo in and start playing heavy metal music in terms of that decision, it's not right for you to say, you know, let's just have a unilateral decision, what I say goes. But instead, well, the people who are going to be affected by it as well have to discuss things. And really what I would say is that it's about people who participate in a given activity being able to manage that activity themselves. It's about self-management, really. That's what I would mean by direct democracy. In terms of mechanisms, I would stress consensus in certain, well, again, there's the same principle that it depends on the circumstances and depending on the degree by which people are affected by a decision. But consensus is really, because a lot of people misunderstand direct democracy as being majoritarian, so the 51% basically decide the affairs of the 49%. To me, I don't think that's really what democracy should be about. Democracy is about negotiation. It's a collaborative, it needs to be a collaborative activity in which, well, people get together and they sort of make decisions as a kind of whole. And so the consensus process is rather different, in which you kind of, basically, if you have a majority of like 51%, the 49% actually have a right to raise their objections, an idea which is completely frowned upon in our current system, of course, but, well, the 49% get to raise their objections. There's a debate that goes on. People get to express their concerns and have their concerns addressed and continue modifying the proposal until you eventually end up with something that everybody's happy with. And that's really the consensus process, is that it's a process of refinement in which, basically, again, it's a process of refinement in which people get together, cooperate, and they make decisions so that it's not the majority making the decisions for the minority, it's everybody making decisions for everybody. That's really the sort of essence of it.
Right. It's funny, just as you described that, I've had a couple of realizations I should have had years ago about normal democracy. I mean, obviously, I'm always reminded of the Churchillian quotation, democracy is the worst form of government apart from all the others. I don't even know if it was him originally who said that. But it's just crossed my mind that the type of democracy that we have in England, which is, as far as I know, is still first past the post, I wonder if the general enjoyments where people say, oh, well, if no one votes and there's only a small amount that vote, then you'll get extreme parties joining in and taking over, and it'll be Hitler all over again. This seems to suddenly strike me as a perfect mechanism for keeping exactly the same kind of system in place without any question. What do you think?
Well, my kind of opinion is like, I kind of started off as being a particularly vulgar anarchist, like, you know, like saying nothing to do with the state ever is justified. Let's just no interaction at all. I think that, to me, although all of them are destructive to anarchist ends, what I would say is that you could perhaps make an argument to say that maybe we could vote for a party which is the least destructive, even though all of them are. And that sort of idea, you know, we could maybe vote for a party that's least destructive to anarchist ends, but that's not at all like the main sort of focus of what we should be doing. That's just a kind of, okay, so there's this political system, let's just, right, pull the lever, bye-bye. You know, that's what the kind of emphasis is on. We want to kind of just ignore it as much as possible, well, putting in someone who is going to be the least harmful, even though they're all harmful. So that's the kind of position that I would sort of take, really. There's more of an emphasis on direct action and community organizing and so on.
Yeah, we've had we had in the States a guy called Scott Keller who ran for president under a resource-based economy, heading purely to essentially troll the system, to get the talking points slightly closer to the media. And we fully understood that he wasn't going to win. And even if he did, it would all be over in 48 hours because I think, as we said in a prior talk, it's absolutely locked down what anybody could do. What's that wonderful line? If voting changed anything, they'd make it illegal.
Yeah.
So I sort of agree with you there. We are very, I would say, because we're such a heterogeneous community that is leaderless and leaderful, in other words, everybody's a leader, we do have a rather split personality when it comes to this point, where some of us think, well, we should actually make concerted efforts and spend serious amounts of money getting into European elections or any local elections, anything, local councillor, and others that say, look, we have to eschew all of political argument in that sense, in terms of voting at least, because it's just a giant waste of time and it's going to corrupt whatever we have. And we do unfortunately occupy both sides of the spectrum on there. Speaking of Occupy, what did you think of Occupy in terms of decision making, in terms of point? This is off the side of anything else. It just interests me. What do you think?
Well, I quite like Occupy, really. I think it's the first really sort of major public response to quite a sustained attack on the working class for the past few decades, with Thatcherism and Reaganism and just generally neoliberal economic policies that have driven people into poverty and crime and deprivation and just absolutely dreadful capitalism that's just wreaking havoc, and it's just wreaking havoc in people's lives and just creating misery and poverty wherever it goes. And Occupy is a major response to that. What's particularly pleasing for me about Occupy is that there's a kind of horizontal approach that's kind of being advocated to a certain extent. So rather than the traditional kind of Marxist thing where you have a kind of, well, I would say more Leninist, because there are horizontalist Marxists that are pretty cool and I like them. It's a break from the traditional Leninist idea of having like, oh, we're going to have a vanguard of elite intellectuals who are going to lead everybody to the abolition of capitalism and everything else. Instead, Occupy the presence of participatory democracy, in which, well, essentially you have workers kind of organizing horizontally, again with a sort of consensus process, sometimes on quite a large scale. That to me is very encouraging, even though it's not something which is solely like, it's not explicitly anarchist. It's like anarchistic practice, but it's not necessarily deliberately kind of anarchist. So you have like, you know, liberals and like sort of liberals and progressives and so on, who are like participating in, well, what's kind of anarchist organization, but they're not a, you know,
not a contradiction in terms.
They're not aware of it, you know. But they, you know, they're kind of like participating in anarchist stuff, but they don't realize it, which to me is pretty cool and exciting, you know.
That is good, yeah, when there are people stealth anarchisting, yeah, or that kind of stuff.
Yeah, literally anarchists, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. We don't even realise we're anarchists. A couple of points that I wanted to bring up, because I think they bear back on what we were saying. I went to Occupy London twice. I went to Occupy Sheffield once, which barely existed. And Peter spoke at Occupy New York and Occupy Los Angeles. And we had a fair amount of interaction. Couple of points that I think bear back towards direct democracy as well. I really liked the way that they would allow each other to speak in public and not clap or cheer. They had like hand signals, which I'd not seen before. And the reason they had these hand signals for sort of disapproval, I mean, if anybody doesn't know what I'm talking about, they can Google Occupy and hand signals, they'll find it. It was essentially a silent, that's right, yeah, hand waving, a silent but visible sign of approval or disapproval or whatever was being said, so that what was being said wouldn't be eclipsed by the crowd, which I thought was excellent. It was interesting to see that the mainstream media interpreted it, of course, as Satanism or something else, the same as that terrorist fist bump that Barack Obama did with his wife back in the 2008 election.
I didn't know that the mainstream media like had a massive problem with that. Did they?
There was only in America, of course. There were things like, you know, what are these hand signs and stuff, and attempting to alienate the audience, basically. It was right before they pepper sprayed everyone at UC Davis, but that was a really good thing. But the thing that I found was very difficult was that there was an evident lack of education about the actual problems. Everyone can see the symptoms of the problems, as in loads of people are being made unemployed, destructive trans-Pacific partnerships are being bled through secret back doors to essentially co-opt any sort of semblance of a market that was left, environmental degradation, all the cronyism that we talk about, the domination of banking and industry over increasing areas of our lives, and all that stuff. However, the solution presented would only, I think, in most cases from what I heard, lead back to the same problems to begin with. No one seemed to say, well, it's actually the system that is in fact broken.
Yeah, there was
a lot of people were saying we need to end neoliberalism, we need to end this particular kind of monetary policy and put a different one away. Did you find that as well?
Apparently there was a friend of mine who's another anarchist, he was participating in Occupy London at some point, and he was talking about how there was someone there who had a banner that said, "Destroy capitalism" or "Make capitalism history." And then some liberal comes up to him and he says, "Oh no, don't do that, that's divisive." He's like a person who's being observably fucked by the current state of affairs. And yeah, they have every right to say, this is what the root cause is, this is exactly why it's happening, and I'm not going to sit here and tolerate it, you know?
Yeah. No, I think that's about right. A lot of people are very worried about hurting feelings. Yeah, I mean, we had a counter chant to the kind of chant that Occupy had. We are the 99% is what Occupy stated. We kept reminding people that we are the 100%, that it's about all of humanity, and that the people who are now in power, you can kill them if you like. You can put them in prison like Iceland did. Somebody will take over where they were. There's just the next level moves into that hierarchical position. It's the fact of the position itself that is the problem. Although, of course, there is such a thing as psychopathy, and we know that CEOs and bankers and the sort of the larger wealth chasers do tend to attract psychopathic behavior. That only leads to the same argument that, well, then we can't really tolerate a hierarchical system, can we? If there is a predisposition of some people to not understand what emotions are, to not really understand why you're constrained by these things called emotions, and how hilarious, because it means I can take advantage of you. This is only an argument for the position of horizontalism of any kind, and the taking away of that. However, I think you may disagree with me, huh? What do you think we should do with those in power?
What should we do with the people in power?
It's a nice question to be able to ask, isn't it? What should we do with them?
Okay. Well, physically, this is really a point of disagreement, I would say, in that the nature of capitalism, really, it's an expansionist economic system. It's a system which fundamentally, at its core, has a constant drive to just turn everything into a commodity. And so I don't think that it's really enough to, to kind of construct another system as a competitor and offer that to people. I don't think it's enough to do that, because I think that fundamentally capital is something which just dominates, really, and it will eventually, if you take that kind of approach, there's a very, very large chance that it will essentially be subordinated to the ends of capital rather than a genuine alternative. So what that certainly leads me to say is that, well, we can't have, is that I don't think that capitalism is really the kind of system that we can have that will somehow wither away. It's not something that will wither away to me. It needs to be abolished completely. Now, to abolish capitalism, we have to have an understanding of what it is. Capitalism essentially has three sort of components, really, that I would say. It's private ownership of the means of production, so factories and everything else, markets, and wage labor. And fundamentally, if we're going to abolish private ownership of the means of production, fundamentally what happens is, what we need to do is transfer the means of production from the hands of private owners and instead take them into under public control. That's effectively the transition that's going to have to happen. Now, would private owners of the means of production consent to collectivization if asked to do so voluntarily? Well, if we consider the main factors, collectivization and taking taking industry under public control, that goes directly against their economic interests, because it puts an end to a system which is enriching them every single day. It consolidates their power. Fundamentally, it makes things better for them all the time, and so it would be extremely unlikely, at least in economic terms, for them to consent to that. Another point, again, is that, well, their being in a position of power significantly diminishes their capacity to empathize with others, to understand the degradation that they are directly responsible for. And also, historically, people in positions of power, they have very, very rarely undermined their own power. Rights have never been given away by people in positions of power. They've fundamentally been taken by people, and it's only when they are met with resistance that well, essentially, like, they don't, like, free speech, for example, is not something which originates in some fucking parliament. It's really when people get fundamentally into the habit of saying, this is my right to be able to speak freely and express myself, and if you dare infringe on that, you will be met with violent resistance. And fundamentally, that it's really, like, I'm making the kind of historical point that really people in positions of power have not really given it up, and that rights are taken rather than given. Would you kind of agree that if we kind of built up this kind of critical mass, if you like, and reached a point in which the vast majority of people would agree with basically collectivizing industry and taking it under public control and utilizing it to meet human needs rather than the profit needs of some corporation, I think that, well, private owners of the means of production would, if you take all of these factors into account, would most likely not consent to collectivization if asked to do so voluntarily. And so, yeah.
I would agree with a couple of the points you've made. I've made them myself in public before, so it'd be ridiculous not to. You are absolutely right that the rights that are won are precisely that. They are won. We have won and had to make the case for and marched against the rights of what are laughably called minorities, black people, people of Hispanic origin, anybody who's not white, basically. That's been fought and won. It's not been offered. It's been taken. It's been demanded. It's been considered self-evident. Any sort of rights to do with labour have been demanded. I mean, all you have to do is go back and read the stories that Dickens is based on. I mean, my God, Dickens is hardly fiction when it comes to the 18th and 19th century in terms of working conditions. The points where I think I would add emphasis is that, yes, you're right. There needs to be and has been an effort for the public understanding for the necessary need to move away from the system that we have on a systemic basis. What some people call systemic activism rather than political lobbying of any kind. That does need to be required, because even if you're going to end up with a system of, let's say, direct democracy, without a decent education about the state of affairs of the planet, or the state of affairs of what science can do, you can be free to make the decisions all you like. You're going to end up making inferior decisions. We also, or at least I also, think that increasingly we are allowing more and more of our decisions to be made by computers. Just the other day on IO9, there was a fascinating article that said that computers are now solving maths problems that humans can't check anymore. They're so big and they're so advanced that we have to take computers' words for them. And this has to do with the sort of the very, very big data nature. So the questions are becoming bigger and bigger and more complex, and therefore also have bigger ramifications upon the way that we operate. And therefore, some of that gets taken away necessarily from the idea of any sort of democracy in that sense. The kind of direct democracy we speak about ends up with the ability to interface with, if you like, a globally interconnected network of everything that we know about everything in the present state of things, and to be able to offer your own solutions or even just suggestions if you don't know, if it's not your area of expertise. But that requires us all to become scientific generalists, which we are not at the moment. What is it? Lawrence Krauss recently said that actually you're not literate until you're scientifically literate as well. You're not literate. Imagine that, calling yourself illiterate for that reason. I now call myself illiterate in that way. you are, of course, also right that the fact that there is so much vested interest, the fact that the position of dominance and hierarchy is itself almost an unrelinquishable aspect. All it takes is to see billionaires lose their billions, and what do? They go home and murder their families and set their mansions on fire. They wouldn't do this if there weren't some horrendous personal attachment to their position. The final moments of Zeitgeist moving forward, the third film in the Zeitgeist trilogy, which broadly underline the efforts of the movement, I suppose, at least the last two of the three do, envisions, I suppose, what would be the ideal example, which is that there is just a mass walkout of all of society. People appear and protest on the streets, and they just stop working. And they, in a sort of a gestural way, they throw all the money in front of the banks and burn it because they don't want the money anymore. They want to go straight for the resources. That strikes me as being very, very close to the idea of what you were speaking about with me yesterday, the idea of union action against businesses. The only thing I would like you to consider is that some bankers now claim that we live in something called a plutonomy, where even with the non-functioning of quite a lot of business and sort of production, if you like, the amount of automation that's taken place and the amount of capital that's now tied up in purely capital itself rather than anything meaningful is so big that the underclass, as they would call it, anybody who's having to be a wage slave for a living, is essentially irrelevant and can be dispensed with. I don't know if you think that's a realistic thing, whether worker power has been diminished actually as a consequence of the way that our current society has now moved more and more towards money creating more money in an almost automated way, and whether that changes in any way the necessary process that we would have to resolve what Lucy Parsons describes in your video as the non-ability for those in power to ever let you vote their power away. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I think that fundamentally they won't let us basically build up popular opinion. Fundamentally, we're going to have to defend ourselves. Historically, there have been popular anti-capitalist sentiments which have eventually been drummed out of people. In America, for example, quite a few years, I think it was 18th century, I'm not quite sure. It might have been 18th century or 19th century, but the idea of wage slavery being essentially just a mild form of chattel slavery, where there's not much of a perceived difference between selling yourself and renting yourself. It's just a matter of the time scale, really. The idea of wage slavery was very popular. The idea that the workers should run the mills, that was very popular. And in fact, those positions were actually the positions of the Republican Party at the time. But over time, that popular opinion has just been drummed out of people. And now, there's been a very violent labor history in America, really. So fundamentally, I'm not comfortable with the idea that we can just build up popular opinion. To me, the ruling capitalist class will not allow a build-up of popular opinion, and they will not just give it away that they are lacking, literally, in the capacity to empathize with others. And I would say that without expropriation of the capitalist class, capitalism will continue. So I'm not keen on pure non-violence. I think that really we need a sort of a diversity of tactics, really.
Okay, I'll list you two examples of something that may help in our discourse here, because the Zeitgeist movement bills itself as explicitly non-violent. But that's because we think that we hold to a nice description by Buckminster Fuller. He said, "You never win by fighting the existing system. The way you defeat an existing system is to build a system that makes the existing system obsolete." And that's not quite the same as competing with an existing system. I would cite two examples that I think give us some hope in this arena, I would hope. The first one is J. Rockefeller. J. Rockefeller is not a decent human being. I'll say it straight away. He comes from a whole line, of course, I don't have to tell you this, a whole line of banking elitists that span now multiple centuries. But J. Rockefeller was caught on camera saying, essentially, that the internet should never have been invented. Because it structurally allows, in a way that's very hard to control, the kind of discourse that you and I are now having that would have been structurally quite easy to impose against back when our communication had to be physical, and where it had to be almost spatial, where we would have to be in the same room, or at least both have a telephone. And then it was only you and me. By the end of next week, many thousands will have heard what you and I have said to each other. So that's the first one. The second one is the advent of a type of production that behaves differently to any sort of centralized production in a factory, and that is things like three-dimensional printing. 3D printing has taken over the last couple of years. It's now essentially the same as rapid prototyping, where anybody with a couple of $100 or a couple of €100, even a few thousand if you can afford it, can now buy a machine that behaves in a way that production capital used to, where consumer capital and production capital are becoming the same sort of thing. I'm probably using incorrect phrases for this, but where the types of means of production are now becoming more distributed, and that has actually come from capitalism itself. That's the argument at least made by Jeremy Rifkin in his upcoming book, The Zero Marginal Cost Society. He may not be correct, but I think that it is at least somewhat of an amelioration that the means of production are no longer purely in large, terrifying, alienating warehouses, and that they may actually be producing things that aren't even useful for people, but that both types of product and the product itself can now be manufactured on a shared basis through sharing the actual schemata online. If you want to have a look at this, the Pirate Bay, which interestingly enough is banned in most of the UK now, has a whole section called Physibles, halfway between physical and visible, where you can download schemata for very complex things, including toys, including vases, including what is at the moment still a very basic form of a good, but I think is growing and will enable people to increasingly make those masters of ours slightly more obsolete than we could have hoped to have done purely by education itself. Do you hold much hope for that sort of thing, or do we think that there's still going to be some sort of violence at some point?
Well, I think that automation is certainly going to cause a lot of problems for capitalism, and I'm looking forward to that. The
Sure.
Again,
front row seats, man. You got front row seats.
The expansionist nature of it is just a problem for me. The fact that it's maybe becoming more compact and that it's going to become more accessible that's certainly significant. However, it's just like, even if, like, in terms of how things have progressed thus far, even if they become less labor intensive and more capital intensive, there has still been a kind of drive that has just led to the enrichment of elites and just impoverishing the vast majority of people. That just continues to happen, and they might use whatever new technology is there to their own advantage. I think that discouraging violent kind of resistance I think it encourages passivity, in that it pacifies people. It doesn't take into account the fact that, well, violence is already here. We are already being aggressed against, essentially through the fact that the means that we need to survive are effectively ring-fenced and they're kept away from us. That, to me, is an act of aggression. And I think that expropriating that and essentially bringing things under popular control is just it is justified on the grounds of self-defense, really. There's also the fact that, to me, I definitely hold the position that without coercive expropriation, capitalism will continue. There's also the fact that the relation that has to the state and the way that, of course, they're connected. But you can also argue it from the other side. So you can say that nonviolence also protects the state, because the state is a fundamentally, it's basically the three sorts of components. There's monopoly on violence, a monopoly on perceived legitimate violence, which is held in the hands of some kind of military institution, either internal or external. So you've got the police force, the military. There is a centralized administrative body which exercises control over that apparatus, and also there is a clearly defined geographical area in which that occurs. And that is essentially what we could call a state. And to me, a struggle against some kind of oppression, of course, because it's linked with capitalism and racism and patriarchy and everything else, the fact that they're all linked together, really, that the different forms of oppression are intersectional, and that the state is, of course, an expression of some of those forms of oppression, as well as being a form of oppression in itself. A struggle against oppression necessitates some kind of conflict with the state, to me, because it challenges the state's monopoly on violence. So that's what I would say is another problematic thing. There's also the fact that often people argue that really, like at protests, for example, I mean, there are folk who do the whole black bloc thing, where they kind of smash up like state and corporate property. Personally, I don't think that that's productive. When I say that they have the moral justification to do that, probably, yeah, because of the inherently violent nature of the institutions. But there's a misconception in which people assert that they are government provocateurs or something, or that they're kind of, that being violent is playing into their hands. I wouldn't agree with that. I would say it's only to the extent that it can be contained. So it's only to the extent where carrying out a certain degree of violence will be effective. Well, it's only to the extent that a certain degree of violence can be contained. And once you've done that, we can just put you in jail. That's the only degree of violence that they will kind of accept. They will not accept a kind of violence that will effectively challenge the existing system completely and be a legitimate threat to power. And that kind of thing, that kind of coercion I'm really talking about is, well, basically expropriation, general strike, that sort of thing. You know.
I think the ultimate point that Occupy made, or had made for it, was one that needed to be made because you and I live in the long peace. We live in Europe that hasn't had a war with itself in 75 years. And we've forgotten what real state oppression is like, and the fact that there would be such a thing as state oppression. We think that we live in a nice, comfortable democracy where nothing bad will really happen. Yeah, it doesn't work very well, but it's not a massive direct threat. We could probably change it if we wanted to. But after Occupy started asking the proper questions, like, for example, an end to the types of tax systems that the US have, or anything like that, you know, full reserve-backed money, for example, even that, then they were met with the truncheons and the mace and the murders and the proper jackboot state violence. And I think it was not the killings, obviously, but which were luckily fairly minor. But I think it was a good reminder for our generation that actually the real weapon, the first weapon, after you've had your little conversation, the first weapon from the state is full-on violence and jail time and kettling. And that is going to have to be met at some point. So I do agree with you in that way. I think it's going to lead to violence, but I think, unfortunately, the violence will be initiated by the state. I'll put it that way.
Yeah.
I would hope, and I would put my efforts behind trying to be as non-violent as possible, because I always wonder, you know, where does it stop? Is it going to end in the sort of French Revolutionary Terror style of killings, where you actually end up executing those who are in power? What about their families? What about their daughters and their cousins and the people who are second in line? You breed this sort of Hydra type of effect, or do you? I don't know. It's something that I desperately try and avoid in my work, but I don't know, man. Maybe it's one of these inevitable things from power itself. I guess our big job is to try and mitigate it as much as possible, or at least that's how I see it.
I would take a sort of I wouldn't ever I wouldn't resign myself to non-violence only. Well, because the state doesn't really care if you're non-violent. Neither do the capitalists, really. So I wouldn't resign myself to non-violence. However, I would say that we should be as non-violent as we can. But I think that pure non-violence to me is it pacifies the population, and it maintains, it doesn't take into account the existing violence that's already here, that people are experiencing every day, the kind of structural violence that you talk about.
Sure. Well, can I give you an example of one that may not fit that model? Actually three. I'll give you three. August 1963, the Great March on Washington, Martin Luther King. We were talking about how those kinds of rights are only taken, not granted. That was non-violent. In fact, it was Dr. King who was packing a gun in his early years, who was dissuaded by Bayard Rustin, the real brains behind the March on Washington, along with A. Philip Randolph, to go fully non-violent, but to go big. Now, admittedly, that was the march for what, as they call it, jobs and freedom. It is a smaller subset. It's still within the capitalist structure, but at least they did manage to do it, especially back in the days, in the 60s, when it was pretty much okay to kill black people still, where there was a very, very heavy weighting against that kind of thing. People got away with it even more than they do now in that part of America still. The other one I can think of is Argentina. You've actually mentioned that in your own video. I don't know how non-violent that was. I must admit my own ignorance on that one. But the third one I know is non-violent, and that was Iceland 2 years ago. Where they essentially did jail the bankers. That is a form of violence, I will concede, but they essentially had almost a velvet revolution, where they essentially said, we're not paying the debt, thank you very much, and we're going to be resetting our system. What do you think? Does that provide any kind of evidence that we could do this?
I don't know, I mean, to my knowledge, well, I've heard that basically there are still capitalists in power in Iceland. That's a more specific thing. There's a book by Peter Gelderloos, basically an anarchist, called How Nonviolence Protects the State. And he goes through various different examples of how resigning yourself specifically to nonviolence only is, well, he lists here, he says that it's ineffective, racist, statist, patriarchal, tactically and strategically inferior, and deluded. So he goes through quite a long list, really.
Does he back those one-word statements up well? We'll link the book in the description, by the way, so people can go to it. We want to get all of your stuff.
I'm just briefly looking here. He talks about the civil rights movement. It's given as one of the most important episodes in the pacifist history. Across the world, people see it as an example of non-violent victory, but like the other example discussed here, it was neither a victory nor non-violent. The movement was successful in ending de jure segregation and expanding the minuscule black petty bourgeoisie, but these were not the only demands of the majority of movement participants. They wanted full political and economic equality, and many also wanted black liberation in the form of black nationalism, black intercommunalism, or some other independence from white imperialism. None of those demands were met, not equality and certainly not liberation. I would certainly say that, like the kind of the status of people of color today is still it's still inadequate.
Absolutely, very much the same with women as well. The fact they're still even paid different amounts is still staggering to me. That's interesting.
So
we'll let the various listeners debate this one by themselves. I'm certainly not going to try and win you over, but I think you made some decent points there. Certainly stuff that we need to confront if we're talking about confronting, of course, the huge structural violence that we do have in our systems. Your final criticism is perhaps the most interesting one, and this, I think, will allow us also to run through recommended reading, if you like, for our members from your recommendations for sort of the libertarian and anarchist areas. You state in your video, and we'll play the section that I'm talking about, why don't we just call ourselves part of the left libertarian area, or the libertarian left?
This position of both rejecting the state and the capitalist market basically places TZM on the libertarian left. However, TZM doesn't acknowledge that, primarily because it touts itself as merely being a scientific viewpoint rather than a political one. This, I believe, is to the detriment of TZM's goals because it separates it from other organisations on the libertarian left with shared concerns and objectives, such as the abolition of the state, capitalism, money, commercial exchange, to be replaced with a stateless, non-proprietarian society.
I know where you're coming from with this, and so do a lot of our members, because they say, in effect and in attitude, and probably even as a transition to a full-blown, high-tech, natural law-based, resource-based world, I don't think there's any other way of doing it than to essentially cross the same rivers as the anarchists have. But here's probably why we don't describe ourselves as this kind of political rather than party political. Our focus is on what John McMurtry, a great... he's often described as a Marxian economist, but he isn't, for the simple reason that he talks about there being an implicit value system within capitalism that really does expropriate life and turns it into sort of dead money. His great metaphor for this is that cancer. This essentially mimics life function, so reproduction, the idea of increase and growth, but it's actually just a growth of essentially the tumescence of useless capital, and expropriating all the useful materials from the life host in that sense, which is society. He talks about something called the life ground, which is the indisputable necessities that every sort of society will need: clean water, clean air, the ability to have meaningful social relations, work that is both enriching to the intellect and not dishonouring of its ability, and all the rest of it. And that the ultimate goal that we have is, if you like, a correct form of living, a biopsychosocial basis for life. Now, I maintain, and I think most of our membership do, that there is nothing political about that. That is a biological necessity of all life, and that to call that political, to see it in political terms, may be to already allow the beginnings of an ideological discolouring of what is basically true about life. I found myself thinking about this morning because it's not that I'm disagreeing with you, really. I think you can hopefully hear that. It's that our general attitude to the end goals precludes that we would use terms like libertarian or anarchist to describe them. When I was going through Wikipedia, and I was saying this to you the other day, the thing that strikes any reader first is how many versions there are, and that there's things like mutualism, and there's Luxemburgism, and there's various forms of communism, including the ones that were actually practiced versus the ones that there actually are, and that itself is really quite confusing, and that maybe the reason why that's happened is because there's this almost spray of phenomena and spray of historical activity that has divided ideological efforts the way that almost the churches have been by the idea of Christianity or Islam, and that we without eschewing the ideas completely, try and go directly for the life logic, if you see what I mean. That's probably a bizarre answer. What do you think?
Well, yeah. I would say that I wouldn't say that it sort of transcends politics, because it certainly leads you to political kind of conclusions. But even then, fundamentally, it's like I would say that a very important part is that in order to kind of establish a kind of resource-based economy, if you like, where you try and do as much as possible with as little as possible.
Well said. Well said.
Where you kind of do that as much as possible, that kind of requires that you take the institutions under popular control. So, I mean, it kind of does inevitably lead you to a political conclusion. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to accept this state. It doesn't mean that you have to accept capitalism. It's just the fact that, well, there are different ways of kind of allocating resources, which, and pretty much all of them can be given a political label, you know.
Sure.
I noticed in the last podcast, you mentioned that a lot of political ideologies are a product of class society. I'm not entirely sure what you mean by that. So,
okay. Yeah.
So are you saying that certain political ideologies empower or maintain the existing class society, or that they're just a product of it, or, you know?
I think that to think in almost every form of political stance that there is to define yourself as a self versus the other. It's us versus them. It's this type of set of priorities as dictated or as informed by these sets of thinkers versus usually the state or usually versus other thinkers. I mean, one way that I've noticed that ANCAPs tend to describe themselves is by almost just insulting the kinds of people that they don't agree with, rather than actually really stating anything themselves. They say that Thurston Veblen is filled with ridiculous ideas and all the rest of it. It's almost like, because if you engineer it from my position, life began on this planet not with a political bent. The very first human societies necessarily couldn't have had political ideas because they were in the very difficult and busy process of not dying and trying to live on the basic and very dangerous environment that there was, with no healthcare and anything else. So there were no abstractions of ideology, and all that came about, I think, through the gradual appearance of class societies. Again, I come back to the chapter by Buckminster Fuller, Legally Piggly, in Critical Path, and that we now have to do the very awkward reverse engineering. Probably, you are right, probably through some sort of channel of ideology backwards to the non-ideology, backwards to the basics of the functions of life on the planet and everything that entails, without losing all of the wonderful technology that we have garnered along the way through the scientific process, which would have come about anyway without capitalism, for example, and certainly without the forms of communism that were practiced, although I do agree with you that is essentially a form of capitalism. And so what I see these days is people defining themselves very much like they define themselves as Republican or Democrat, and so that it's almost impossible these days to understand any of these ideas anymore without invoking the whole class system and positioning yourself within it and having to define yourself and finding yourself in a load of arguments that then take away from what we were here to discuss anyway, or at least what I was trying to discuss in public, which is the notions of a type of society based on the way the world really is, rather than the particular kinds of things we could call it. So it's almost both sides of what you were saying. It's informed by class, it's a product of the class system, and also is used to define yourself within that class. I think is how I see it. Would you like to feedback and correct me on my thinking?
Well, one of your first points was that, well, in the kind of original state of affairs in which people were just kind of surviving, it might have been the case that while what they were doing, they weren't aware of whether or not it had any political implications. However, the way in which they organized themselves, of course, they didn't have any money. Kropotkin writes about this in Mutual Aid. He talks about gift economies and how essentially the idea is that basically you kind of, well, in Mutual Aid, Kropotkin writes that, you know, there are certain hunter-gatherer societies which use gift economies. Now, they might have not been aware of the fact that, well, of the relationship that a gift economy has with anarcho-communism, and that it's acting in accordance with anarcho-communist principles. Nevertheless, we can still call it anarcho-communism if by anarcho-communism we mean basically allocating resources according to need rather than profit and that sort of thing, like a gift economy where you basically give what you can and take what you need. Mm-hmm. So I would say that even if they didn't call it anarcho-communism, so anarcho-communism obviously has a certain set of principles, and even though hunter-gatherer societies might have been acting in accordance with those principles, they could still, you know, we might have been able to call it anarcho-communism, even though they weren't aware that, you know, in a future society people will call it this. So I don't see why we should necessarily say that, oh, we don't want to talk about anarcho-communism, because that's a political term, obviously. But really it's a descriptive way of talking about mechanisms of allocating resources that I don't think we should necessarily get away from, really.
Kropotkin also talks about ants very early on in Mutual Aid.
Mm-hmm.
And he says that the devastating organization and incredible elements of the society of ants means that even the much larger insects are routed from their holes and run away. Are ants anarcho-communists?
That's probably a very strange.
It does sound wrong, doesn't it? It sounds very odd. And this is, I think, probably what strikes our membership as odd, although I do understand what you mean, and I think it's a valid point, is that the organizational is political, is essentially what we're saying. Mm-hmm. And the process of being able to update the organizational for any old parts that need to be got rid of, that can be called political as well, I suppose. But I always, we go literally that far back. And we say, what is the basic requirement of life itself on the planet, whether that includes us or not? And of course, our well-being, of course, also includes the well-being of the planet as a whole, because we can't live without it. And so, to what extent can we keep using political terms when we're trying to speak in, without being too reductionist, the most plain of terms when it comes to the concepts that we have? But I can understand, yes, certainly if we're talking hunter-gatherer, if we are talking of some kind of human social organization, they barely had language, I'd imagine. It's, at least for part of it, they would have barely had language. It becomes a very strange idea to suggest that they would have called themselves anything.
Yeah, and it's, the same sort of thing would apply with ants. So, they might even act...
Ants are communists!
Maybe they are. Maybe they are. I don't see what is inherently wrong with basically coming up with a term that we can use to describe a certain way of doing things, economically or politically. I don't see what's particularly wrong with that. I can understand the sort of sentiment that, we need to get away from the current political system, but I don't think that we should act as though political terminology is something that we need to just get rid of altogether.
There's an area in what we discussed that talks about the usefulness of language.
Yeah.
It's something that we haven't talked about for a couple of years openly, just because it's where we started. There are 2 books on this. One of them is a deeply inaccessible and very expensive book called The Science and Sanity by a guy called Alfred Korzybski, who actually invented the whole area of general semantics. And it talks about the meaning and structure of words. It's almost like semiology. It's basically where it's where Chomsky ended up. In terms of his actual job, as opposed to the job that, as he put it, people would probably pay me not to do. And there's a much more accessible book that used to be out of print, but now, thanks to the print-on-demand structure, could be helpful in this area, and it's called The Tyranny of Words by Stuart Chase. You might know Stuart Chase, actually, because he was a fairly well-rounded socialist from the New Deal days. In fact, the phrase New Deal is one that he's credited with inventing. And he wrote this very powerful book on higher-order abstractions, how our language abstracts happily. And we end up talking about things like water, gold, marriage, equality in the same level, as if they all had some kind of reference in the real world. And we tend to assume these things. A dog is not the word dog. It's what he's famous for saying, things like that. And I think that what we've tried to do by trying to speak to this particular attitude that we have with reference to economics and social health and all the rest of it, it has been to deliberately not employ those words so that we don't have to spend too long defining exactly what type of left-leaning anarcho-libertarian we may be, or why we are not a gift economy, or whether we are, as in that part of the video you quoted, anarchist, or anything like that, where we actually end up saying the word twice in a row and hoping that somehow cleans things up, like that poor chap in the audience.
I don't know anyone who says anarchist.
No, I think there was almost, because Peter came up with that, it was like, do you mean pure anarchism? And if so, what does that mean? So we do end up with that, and that's why we end up sometimes saying, look, I really don't know what you mean when you say that we are communists, for example. We had to use this in defense as well. Like people saying, I'll give you a fascinating example. The World Socialist Forum, what are they called? International? No, they used to be called the International Socialists. The World Socialist Movement. Mm-hmm. Very often do 2 things in a row. They come out and criticize the ideas that we have as various forms of unworkability or inadequacy, and then say that we're just the same as the communists, which is what they are. Mm-hmm. I noticed, by the way, that you did this as well, and this is what confused me a little bit. You didn't quite do that. I mean, you had the very good criticisms that we've already spoken about in terms of, well, how do we allocate resources? Do we meet the human needs that are outside of the economic sphere? Do we have time for all that kind of stuff? And then you say that we are left-leaning libertarians. So do left-leaning libertarians also not meet the needs of their population and also have no idea about how to distribute resources? That's the thing that gets confusing after a while, is that those criticisms get subsumed within the sort of the ownership of the area itself. And that may just be down to the discourse we've offered. But I don't want to denigrate your arguments in that kind of way, but it ends up with these very bizarre contortions that we fall prey to as well. So that's sort of where I came from on that.
Right.
You can see how tricky it is, can't you?
Yeah.
However, I will concede this. In the Venn diagram of political and social attitudes to real life, there is such a vast overlap between our attitudes to what's important, how it can be achieved. I mean, you even quoted the bit of Kropotkin that is the only bit that I knew about before I started reading Mutual Aid, which is the idea of fulfilling the most needs possible with the least amount of resources expended. Yes, that is absolutely identical. That is also something that we've openly shared in our major pages as well. The Venn diagram is such an overlap that I think this bit is not a point of contention, and that the kind of solidarity you call for is absolutely appropriate. It's also something that we've done in the past as well, although not yet with the anarchists, at least not to my knowledge. I may be wrong on that. In South America, I think we probably have. But we have quite openly organised our main yearly event. We call it Zeitgeist Day. It usually happens the second weekend of March, where all the people who've been speaking have been essentially not from our movement and have been from the transhumanists who advocate, the idea of the singularity, the idea that one day technology is going to be so quick in its advance that we actually have to update our physical bodies and mental minds and all that stuff to keep up with it. We've brought in Fight for the Future. We have ties variously, or have supported the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which fights for the kind of rights for the internet so we don't damage the networks that we're going to need to be able to employ them correctly in the future for the well-being of more people rather than less. And so in that sense, I would say that we are lacking in that we have not done enough yet with various anarchist groups or libertarian groups of the left and anarchist bent. I'll put it that way. Does that seem fair to you?
Yeah. I watched the Peter Joseph's lecture, Economic Calculation, in a natural law resource-based economy. And he basically talks about the things that we would take into account when making a decision, economically speaking. So, how recyclable is it going to be? How efficient are we going to be, and so on. I think that what was kind of missing was really who. Like, I know that that's kind of annoying, but I think that lecture in particular kind of answers the question of what and how, but really there's kind of I think that there's a need to kind of say who. And I think, the intuitive answer is really just to say, the participants in a given society, the people who are affected by such decisions, they should be the ones who get to participate. And so, what we should be focusing on is building these social bodies to begin with, and start constructing the new society in the shell of the old. And again, this is where the syndicalist ideas come in, of, organizing your workplace and linking them up in your community, and then forming a big federation, general strike, put the capitalists out of business, and then run your own economic affairs. To me, that kind of process is necessary for being able to make those kind of decisions. Is that fundamentally we need to take it under popular control, and that there would definitely be a need to engage with that kind of that kind of direct action of kind of revolutionary unionism, essentially.
I'll give you an example of something that we've tried to do recently, or at least one of our members has tried to do. There's a chap called Douglas Millett, who is a former NASA engineer, systems engineer, who is trying to set up a form of cybernated farm systems, because we talk very often about things like, I mean, one of the great revolutions in food is going to be vertical agriculture, because you're not taking up so much damn space for a start. We can do that thing that every modern socialist with a sense of history will hate, and that's the Enclosure Act. We can de-enclosure the borders that we have in Britain. And he wanted to make something where essentially you create, out of mostly 3D printed materials, the structures that can be deployed then to feed anyone, anywhere, and that are very, very resilient to the environment. And because they're 3D printed, and because it's open source, when it goes and breaks, you don't have to then rely on workforces or rely on the original capital owners to come and give you the replacement part at phenomenal amounts. You just print it yourself. Now, one thing he's run up against, and it's where it speaks more to your point about, if you like, unionizing and putting that kind of direct pressure on the existing system, is that to get that funded is phenomenally difficult because you need the kind of capital that it is in fact seeking to replace. But I do keep coming back to this idea that things like 3D printing, things like self-sustaining agriculture, harvesting your own energy in your home, these kinds of things have within them the seeds that destroy the market that they came out of. And there is a form of direct action within the pursuit of bettering these technologies. I think there will be, overall, I think both of these things will happen. I think your idea of worker solidarity, unionizing, disabling various parts of... because, I mean, look, we're talking as first world people, man. There are buildings collapsing in Bangladesh on the absolutely weakened workers. I think right there you could say that your form of direct action is absolutely needed, and that anything else is really, essentially a form of whistling in the wind. It's like, oh, they need 3D printing. No, they need something way much more quickly, don't they? It's a bizarre form of intellectual bigotry I'm probably exercising. But in our area, I think, or at least in my area, I can really see that promoting and appealing to the public for support for types of technologies that are essentially working like a Trojan horse, that will win the same battle as the armies will the next day, it still has its place even within those areas, and I think that would in a sense describe the who that we are talking about. Places like Indiegogo and Kickstarter, I'm a huge fan of, because even though they're ultimately owned by Amazon in the sense of Kickstarter, they are allowing for a phenomenal amount of capital that's been tied up in people's random stuff that they spend on books to be coagulated in impressive amounts and to produce goods that would have never been allowed on the market, and with the sorts of incentives that often include getting the product itself rather than getting a return on investment in terms of money. And that's a huge inversion of the capitalist process, and it's phenomenally popular. Whether it's fast enough or not, or whether it finally just leads to more established institutions, it's too early for me to be able to say. But my focus certainly comes from there. And I do understand what you mean about the idea of there being, who is it that does this kind of stuff? We tend to say that who does this is the wrong question, and it's how is it arrived at. But there is no doubt that, at least in this uneducated, worldly limited, circumscribed state that we find ourselves in, of ill education, of almost being defined by our marginalization, the fact that we are of a certain class, the fact that we don't speak at least 2 or 3 languages, the fact that we don't have at least a firm grounding in most of the hard sciences, to be able to even speak coherently about this stuff, means that you're going to get, in the beginning at least, the people who do have systems theory knowledge, that do have open source knowledge, which luckily is increasing numbers of children are now having some coding experience, and the fact that it's open source means you can teach yourself in a way if you want to. But there will be, yes, it's a set B of A. So of A being the entire population, there'll be a set B that just as within any sort of system will initiate this. But the real hope and the real final description that we always give is that we'll have reached a point where the education has spread so far out that it is essentially everybody, and that sphere should keep growing, whereas specialization and marginalization and class, all that stuff, tends to shrink that down and down and down, further and further into those kinds of specializations. That's really all I can say on that. I hope that helps.
Yeah, I see.
Well, look, it's been really wonderful speaking to you. Do you have any other points that you feel we should make before we say goodbye? Anything that's burning that I avoided or was wrong about, or that you feel that we should have talked about that we didn't?
Anarchist authors that I would recommend.
Oh, yes, please.
Errico Malatesta, Murray Bookchin, Noam Chomsky, Peter Kropotkin, Emma Goldman, Mikhail Bakunin, Rudolf Rocker, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon.
Proudhon we've quoted before, yeah. Property is theft.
Yeah. And David Graeber as well. David Graeber has a very he's got a book called Debt, the First 5,000 Years, in which he goes through the whole idea of owing people something, and the kind of effect that that's had on people throughout history and its moral connotations and everything else. That's quite an interesting read. He also talks about the myth of barter. So, like when we talk about getting rid of money, the argument is that, well, we started off exchanging goods themselves. So, like, you know, I would take my chickens to the market and swap them for a cow and so on. There was that kind of barter arrangement, and then suddenly we have money. No, that's not true. He kind of, and then, well, the idea was that, well, because of the inefficiencies of barter, we ended up with a money system. And he was kind of saying, well, that's not true. We kind of imagine that barter would have been the case because basically it's the sort of thing that we would imagine doing if we were used to monetary exchange. Then if money went away, then we would start using barter. But he was basically in debt. He talks about how people have been using very complex mutual credit systems and things like that for quite a while before the idea of monetary exchange even kind of arose, and before the idea of debt arose. So, yeah, David Graeber is quite interesting, and he's got lectures and things about it as well.
He did an AMA on Reddit where somebody asked him about the Zeitgeist movement. Actually, he said, "Sure, man, we should try as many things as we can." So he's actually heard of us, which is quite nice. But yes, he's known to some of the people in the movement. We read out an article of his that he did for a magazine recently called "On Bullshit Jobs." Oh, yeah. I don't know if you've come across that one. It's a fantastic one, because we have this sneaking suspicion too that a huge amount of so-called economic activity in the modern day is largely pointless, isn't needed, and could be ended tomorrow without any real effect on people other than that. But yeah, Graeber is certainly someone we'll happily link him as well.
Yeah, well, of course, there's the fact that, well, with the sort of private property arrangement, you need to of course, the private owner can't be everywhere at once. They have to fundamentally keep a watch on all the workers, so they have to have all these bureaucratic supervising jobs, in which, well, basically you basically have these people who are there to basically stand over workers who, you know, otherwise could just be running their own economic affairs without being dominated, you know.
Yeah. And in terms of how about videos as well? One that I found very useful, one that was actually passed around a couple of months ago as well, and recommended to us as being extremely relevant to our cause, is one I've mentioned to you as well before already, which is Living Utopia, the Spanish anarchists and the Spanish Revolution, which is on YouTube. But do you have any other videos that you'd recommend that would be good for people to sort of get acquainted with?
There's, well, I don't know if he's an anarchist, but basically sort of anarcho-communist ideas. Charles Eisenstein.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, we know that dude as well.
He's a proponent of a gift economy. And
Sacred economics.
Sacred economics. There's a short film that you can sort of check out. It's like 15 minutes long or something like that, where it kind of criticizes money and all this other stuff, which is certainly very interesting.
Okay, excellent.
Bookchin, Bookchin is particularly relevant for the kind of post-scarcity approach and the kind of emphasis on ecological concern. And Rudolf Rocker, his kind of approach is, well, he's a syndicalist, so it's kind of to do with labor union organization and so on.
Okay, excellent. Fantastic. Well, we will add all that, because those of our members who don't know any of this stuff yet will happily dive into it and absorb it. One of the things we pride ourselves on is that we're essentially an anti-institution and should absorb as much as we can that fits into the worldview that we should be pursuing, science and systems and equality of all kinds. And we'll happily have our values updated, definitely, always. There's nothing fixed about this. In fact, our ultimate goal, and it's another reason why I think we've always had a problem with the political side of things, is because mostly, and this is only really true of party politics, political leanings essentially want to perpetuate themselves, whereas our ultimate goal, of course, is not to exist anymore, is to not need to advocate what should in the future become utterly self-evident. But we will do our best to include all of this, and I must thank you once again for this. It's been really, really good, and I recommend all of our listeners to go and check out Libertarian Socialist Rants and watch absolutely all of it. It is it's never a waste of your time. Thank you very much, Cameron.
Cheers.
My thanks again for Cameron coming on the show and engaging with us in his critiques and viewpoints. It's all very interesting stuff. Meanwhile, we are off to organise the rest of our Z-Day events, so please do feel free to join us in London and in the various events around the world, including Toronto as well, as listed in the previous show. Next time around, we will highlight a couple of events around the world that people can go to. Meantime, we hope everybody stays well and keep learning and keep discovering the kind of society that we require when we apply science, logic, inferential logic, and human reason to better coordinate our life on this planet in a holistic, decentralized, and more abundant way than we presently do. Until then, this has been Ben McLeish with guest Cameron Watt of Libertarian Socialist Rants. Thank you very much for listening.